Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPad 4th generation and see how the specific iPad holds up in 2023. Now, the first thing I would probably tell you is I really don't think this iPad is worth buying anymore. I think it was very impactful when it first came out, but in this day and age, it doesn't really make too much sense to buy it. So I would probably recommend avoiding this type of iPad and at the bare minimum, buying something like an iPad 6th generation or an iPad that's still supported with software. So I will leave some of those linked down in the description. You can get that from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the specific iPad, to be honest, it still looks very good. It does not look that cheap, it doesn't look that old. And I do think Apple back then made a pretty good choice of making this iPad, at least, even though visibly it doesn't look that much more different than the first generation iPad, I still think it looks pretty good for the most part. So on the front, we had a massive 9.7-inch IPS LCD panel, and it was a pretty good looking panel. I think back then, these types of displays looked really good. And you have to remember the age in which this iPhone came out. This iPhone came out in 2012. This was the same year that the iPhone 5 came out. So you have to kind of keep that in the back of your head. When you're getting something like the iPad 4th, you are getting this iPad that came out at the same time as the iPhone 5. That iPhone 5 has been out for a long time. So this iPad, in return has been, around for a long time as well. But the panel itself really wasn't that bad. Now you have a lot of bezel around it. That is probably the more concerning thing. So when you have an iPad like this, clearly you're not getting the layest looking iPad. It's definitely going to look a little bit outdated, but I think that's okay as well. Like I said, you kind of know what you're getting into, and for that moment, I think it looked pretty good. It didn't really look that outdated either. So I do give, Apple a lot of credit for making this iPad look pretty decent. Now on the bottom, this was probably the bigger difference for the most part. This iPad actually ended up bringing a Lightning port. So that was a really cool thing that we actually ended up having here. So that in and of itself may have been enough of a reason for people to go and switch from their, 30-pin connector, iPad to this newer one. And I think that was a really cool thing that, Apple kind of did here too. So in my opinion, always having that type of capability of just having one of those things like a Lightning port, such a small thing you'd think about nowadays, but that was a big deal, at least in my opinion, for the specific iPad. Now on top of that, on the back, we had a pretty decent aluminum back on this iPad as well. And for all the iPads Apple's ever made, none of them have ever felt cheap. All of the iPads have felt very premium. They feel very expensive. And this was no exception. Although, it was kind of an expensive iPad, it still is feeling very premium, which is something that I always love thinking about. Again, when you're getting an iPad like this, it's definitely not going to be the most expensive iPad of all time. Now, you also had that camera on the back, which was very interesting. And overall, the iPad 4, I still think looks very good. Is it the most expensive feeling? Is it the best feeling iPad right now? Clearly not. This thing doesn't look as good as, the other iPads that have came out probably in the last 5 years, to be honest. But this thing still looks pretty good, and I'm actually really happy with the way Apple made this thing back then. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of the cameras, like I mentioned, this thing has that 5 megapixel camera on the back and has a 1.2 megapixel camera on the front. Now this camera clearly is pretty much not the best camera of all time, and it definitely is showing its age. I think that's the best way to put it. However, you have to think about it back then in 2012. I owned a phone back in 2012, but I could never even imagine owning an iPad, mostly because they felt so expensive and I just didn't really know where they fit into the landscape. But when Apple started actually producing those cameras on their iPads, it started to make a little bit more sense, especially for people who are students. If you wanted to go ahead, for a case, if you wanted to take photos of a specific thing you're looking at, let's say you're in a class and you want to take notes and photos and whatnot, well, you had that capability of taking that on this type of iPad, which was honestly really cool. Now, even though the camera here really isn't that functional for the most part, it's kind of in line with an iPhone 4S camera, maybe. That's kind of the best way to put it. You can film 1080p video and whatnot. This is definitely not a camera I would use on an everyday basis anymore. Your iPhone at that moment probably had a better camera, but it's still really nice that you could pretty much have a camera like this. There weren't really a lot of features, but we have to give it some credit. I'm glad this thing had some sort of features there like that. So at the end of the day, I kind of like how this iPad had a camera. Even though it wasn't that great, I still liked it if I'm being honest. So that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of the software and the longevity portion, this iPad has been unsupported with software for many, many years now. So that is expected. That's exactly what we expect from an iPad that's over 10 years old now. So nothing is going to change there. This iPad is not randomly going to get its software updates again. It's pretty much gone for good. But I still think, and I've said this before, but a lot of iPads that have been unsupported with software still feel fairly smooth. Like they still perform kind of decent. And that's been something that's always kind of surprised me. Whenever I would actually go and open up one of my older iPads, it's always weird to me how some of these iPads actually perform decently well. So I would 100% not recommend buying this iPad. Please do not buy this iPad at all. But it's still kind of smooth on iOS 10. And some have said that iOS 10 was one of the better versions of iOS. So, we're on iOS 16 now. This thing's been unsupported with 6 versions of software now. So again, no point in picking this thing up. But it is kind of interesting when you kind of look at an iPad like this and seeing how long it lasted. Personally, I kind of feel like it could have lasted maybe a little bit longer. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of the performance of this iPad, this device has that Apple A6X chip inside of it with a 1 gigabyte of RAM. Now, I don't want to make fun of this iPad too much. We all have to kind of start off with something. But with the iPad 4, it was kind of in line with something like the iPhone 5. The iPhone 5 had that A6 chip inside, and I don't know if this was the first iPad to bring an A6 chip. I could be mistaken. Maybe another iPad brought it or another device brought it. But what I will tell you is it was a good performing iPad when it first came out. Right? When it first came out, it was probably one of the best performing tablets at that moment, which was really nice. And personally, whenever I used an iPad during this moment back in 2012, 2013, I was surprised how smooth they are and how fast they were. But the problem with the iPads during that moment was that they just didn't really stand out compared to the iPhones. If you had an iPhone, it really kind of felt like a bigger iPhone. That's pretty much all it was. However, since then, the sentiment has completely changed. And now that we have actual full-on accessories, keyboards, we have Apple Pencils, there's a lot more of a reason to go buy an iPad if you already have an iPhone than ever before. So that has been something that's always stood out to me as well. So even though right now this is not a good performing iPad, back then, I'm sure if you're playing a bunch of games, if you're using notes and whatnot, doing whatever you wanted to do, this tablet had a lot of capability, and that's something that's always stood out to me as well. So clearly, this would not be the first iPad I would recommend buying, but back then, this was the main flagship, so I think the performance pretty much, was top tier during that moment. Now, another big thing that I love about these iPads is actually the battery life. They had massive size batteries, 11,560 milliamp hour battery inside of this thing. That should be illegal how big of a battery size this thing is. It is massive. So that is one thing that I've always looked at these iPads, and with the amount of massive cameras they have inside of them and the massive battery, not camera, that's always been something that's been really cool about these iPads. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I would definitely tell you is that I definitely do think that the iPad 4 is not worth buying at all. It is not worth buying pretty much in any way, unless you're planning on buying it as a collector's item or something, then maybe it'll make sense. But for the average person out there, it really doesn't make any sense of buying the specific iPad. It's been outdated for quite a bit of time. It hasn't gotten software updates in a long time either. So this just sits in an awkward spot. It's not worth really buying in any form or fashion like it used to be. So that is kind of how it's summed that up. Now, if you want, like I said, iPad 6, iPad 7, iPad 8, maybe even an iPad 5, if you are on an extreme budget, getting an iPad 5 might not be that bad of a deal either. But if you plan on buying this thing and using it on an everyday basis, I couldn't disagree with that more, in my opinion. So in terms of that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hope I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.